Jason Delaney's flashlight died just as the water rippled beneath him. In the black hush of the Everglades, his yellow kayak drifted between sawgrass and cypress roots, and then the surface broke. A snout, a low hiss, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Heart pounding, he froze as a massive head nudged the hull, then another. Alone, unarmed, with the murky swamp pressing in, Jason realized some nightmares don't end when you wake up. Megan Delaney watched the live chat numbers tick upward as her brother wrapped up his weekend shoot by the Ochlockonee River. On screen, Jason's grin was easy, the morning sun slanting through pine trees and dancing off the water. He'd been testing his new 4K camera rig, every angle sharp, every color alive. Yet when he glanced off camera to one side, his smile faltered for a moment, as if something beyond the frame had caught his eye. "Everything set for the Everglades trip?" Megan prompted, her voice steady, even though her heart had tightened the moment he'd mentioned soloing the swamp. She knew him, 31, an amateur wildlife photographer and weekend survivalist, always chasing that perfect shot and that quiet challenge. "Got everything," Jason said, leaning back on his hands. "Just need some solitude. No crowds, no guides, just me, my kayak, and the lens." He flicked the GoPro lens toward the riverbank. "You'll love the sunset shots." Megan exhaled. "Just be safe. Text me your route one more time." "Promise." He gave her a thumbs up, then laughed lightly. "I'll call you again before I launch. Big Cypress. Friday morning." She watched him pack up gear, 3 protein bars, 2 jugs of water, a portable charger, and that GoPro perched like a sentinel on his shoulder strap. What he didn't pack, Megan knew, was a satellite beacon, and she feared he'd never learn the lesson Dad tried to teach him so many times. A memory flashed across her mind. 10-year-old Jason wobbling in a tandem kayak, Dad steadying him with a gentle hand. The river had looked so vast then, brimming with possibility. Dad's quiet voice. "Respect the water, buddy. It's beautiful, but it's always in charge." Jason's laugh broke the flashback as he hoisted his duffel into the truck bed. "Okay, Dad," he'd said then, "but I can handle it." Megan glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight, and the screen had gone dark, Jason signing off with promises of stellar footage. Now, alone in her bedroom, Megan texted him, "Be careful, I love you." Before dawn on Friday, Jason navigated the narrow ramp at Big Cypress with a practiced shove of his yellow kayak. Mist curled over the water like ghostly tendrils, and the squat hum of cicadas underscored the swamp's hush. His boots tapped on the aluminum deck as he clipped on his life vest and double-checked the GoPro's battery. No satellite beacon, he reminded himself. No excess weight. He'd relied on maps before, old-school grids, landmarks. He felt invincible. He slipped into the cockpit, the paddle cutting through mirror-glass water. Everywhere he looked, sawgrass and cypress roots wove a living maze. The only sounds were his breath and the soft lap of water against the hull. He raised the camera, framed the dim light filtering through moss-draped branches, and whispered to the lens, "This is Jason Delaney, signing off on civilization. See you on the other side." That last smile, caught in the lens, was bright, but it would be the last easy moment before the swamp claimed all sense of time and direction. The air was cool and damp when Jason pushed off from the rickety ramp at Big Cypress, the swollen river ringing a low sigh around him. Dawn's pale light diffused through Spanish moss, tracing ghostly patterns on the water's surface. He braced his feet on the kayak's aluminum footrests, double-checked the tension on his life vest straps, and reached for the GoPro mounted above the console. "This is Jason Delaney," he announced in a low voice, more to steady his own throat than for an audience he could no longer see. "Day 1, solo Everglades journey, supplies solid, GoPro, charger, bars, water, no satellite beacon." Let's see what this swamp really looks like. He paddled into the mangrove tunnel, each stroke sending ripples that curved around entwined roots. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves rose up, thick and primal. In the lens, cypress knees jutted like ancient sentinels guarding a cathedral built in darkness. Occasionally, a kingfisher flashed, turquoise wings cutting through the hush, and Jason angled the camera, whispering soft encouragement. "Keep your distance, buddy. I'm not lunch." For hours, he traced the route sketched on a weathered topographic map. Every bend seemed familiar at first, until one channel narrowed and the current quickened. Jason frowned, scanning the GPS app on his phone. 30% battery left. He tucked the phone into a dry bag, but kept one eye on the blinking icon, less for navigation and more for proof he'd tried. Suddenly, a swell of water rose beneath him, lifting the bow with surprising strength. He gripped the paddle, leaning back to counter the surge. The tide was coming in faster than he'd anticipated. Beneath the tinted GoPro lens, muddy water churned around tangled roots and low-hanging branches. His heart picked up when he realized he'd drifted past the marker he'd noted on his map, an old cypress stump shaped like a leaning tower. A moment later, adrenaline spiked as the current snatched his kayak sideways, pressing the hull against a submerged log. Jason released the paddle, braced an oar against the log, and shoved with all his weight, freeing himself with a sharp crack of wood. He winced. The hull had scraped, leaving a shallow gouge. He glanced at the camera, hoping for a close-up of that sound, but the screen blinked off, battery drained. He frowned, tucking the GoPro into its buoyant casing. No beacons, no phone, just him and the swamp. A soft wind rustled through the mangroves, carrying a distant croak that sounded almost like laughter. He straightened, gathering resolve. "Okay," he murmured, voice low enough that even the bobbing kayak seemed to hush in respect. "Time for Plan B." He scanned the water's edge for recognizable landmarks, the leaning cypress, the old homestead pilings, the cluster of air plants, but found only shapeless shadows. With a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and dipped the paddle back into the dark water, each stroke a vow to stay calm, stay alert. The swamp had whispered its warning. Now he had to listen. As he disappeared around the next bend, the rising tide whispered behind him, promising both danger and, perhaps, something he couldn't yet name. The Everglades had claimed his course, and Jason Delaney was only just beginning to understand its power. By late morning, the Everglades had swallowed any sense of certitude Jason once carried. The current, stronger than he'd anticipated, tugged his kayak into a tangle of mangrove arms. He leaned heavy on the paddle, muscles quivering with effort, but each stroke seemed to circle him deeper into the maze. The sun climbed higher, its glare bouncing off the murky water and turning every knot of roots into ominous shadows. Jason paused to catch his breath, chest tight beneath his life vest. He fumbled for his phone's dry bag, hoping for just a sliver of GPS life. 30% yesterday morning. Now, flat. He set the empty device on the deck beside his pack and stared at the horizon of identical green-black water. His throat constricted as a distant hiss echoed through the mangroves, water slapping against unseen scales. The memory of that first night's encounter flickered at the edge of his mind, and for the first time, doubt gnawed at him. He pulled out his topographic map, creased and stained, and spread it on his lap. His fingers traced the squiggled lines of canals and bayous, but nothing matched the knotted roots rising around him. He'd planned for this. He was a survivalist weekend warrior, but his confidence felt as brittle as the old paper in his hands. Pushing the map aside, Jason steadied himself and dipped back into the water. Each paddle stroke sent a tremor up his arms, but the current moved faster than he could force against it. He pushed until his shoulders seared and his breathing grew ragged. Then, in frustration, he let the current carry him, only to be deposited moments later into a narrow channel choked with submerged logs. "Come on," he muttered, eyes flicking over the water's surface for a way through. He spotted a faint break in the debris, an opening barely wide enough for his hull. With a deep breath, he angled the bow and inched forward, scraping wood and mud against the kayak's underside. The sound grated in the still air, and Jason's heart slammed against his ribs. Any noise here could draw attention. Gators, pythons, worse. He forced himself to remain silent, his knuckles white on the paddle shaft. At last he broke free into an open expanse where the water reflected the cloudless sky. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. The sun's heat pressed down, stinging the backs of his neck and hands. He tipped one jug of water to his lips, cool but tinged with swamp sediment, and listened to the heavy silence. No birds called. No wind stirred. It felt as though the Everglades had paused to watch him falter. He checked his remaining supplies: one protein bar wrapped in greaseproof paper, half a jug of water, a portable charger still clinging to life. The sight of dwindling resources jolted him back into focus. He recorded a brief voice memo. "Day 1 afternoon. Lost more ground than distance. Batteries gone. Need to find a recognizable landmark. Old homestead pilings or that leaning cypress, but nothing standing out. Stay calm." As he spoke, the sun dipped toward the western canopy, turning the water's surface copper. Shadows lengthened, and Jason shivered despite the heat. He needed to find a safe spot for the night, somewhere he could tie off, rest, and plan. But as he scanned the inky silhouettes of mangroves ahead, a cold certainty settled in his gut. He was no longer paddling towards safety. He was drifting into the unknown. As twilight descended, the Everglades transformed into an alien realm. Jason guided his yellow kayak into a sheltered cove ringed by sawgrass and cypress stumps, the water a molten mirror of fading light. He secured the bow to a low-hanging branch, knotting the rope tight and double-checking the line as the sun dipped behind the trees. Every sound felt amplified: the rasp of wind through Spanish moss, the distant croak of frogs, the plink of water droplets off leaves. He peered through the GoPro's night vision lens, grateful for its faint green glow. His heartbeat pulsed loud enough to drown out his own breath. With deliberate calm, he unpacked his tarp and plastic sheet, draping them over his legs. He rifled through gear for a moment: protein bar wrapper, empty water jug, before settling into the cockpit, curled ankle to ankle. His flashlight lay at his feet, buried beneath his pack, just out of reach. A memory surfaced. 12 years old, clutching a splintered paddle as his father coached him through a whitewater rapid. Dad's voice had been steady. "When the river roars, you listen. You don't fight every wave. Just keep your balance. Keep your head." Back then, Jason had bristled at the warning. Now, he drew on it like a lifeline, pressing his palms flat against the hull for stability. The swamp's heartbeat quickened as darkness closed in. In the distance, lightning bugs winked on and off like distant beacons, but no thunder followed. Jason wrapped the tarp tighter, his lungs shallow to minimize sound. He dared not shift. Every muscle coiled, waiting. Then silence broke. A low thump against the kayak's side. He froze, paddle midair, mind racing. His pack shifted slightly as the second bump arrived, deliberate, probing. Through the night vision lens he detected only ripples, then a reflective glimmer, emerald eyes skimming the surface. One set, then another. Jason held his breath. A third bump rocked the hull, sending tremors up his spine. His life vest felt like a lead weight. He didn't dare exhale. In the black hush, the swamp itself seemed to lean in. He recalled his father's words once more. "Stay calm. They sense your fear." He willed his body still, willing his beating heart to settle. Hours stretched taut, no light but for the faint moon above the canopy, no sound but his own blood drumming in his ears. Under the lens, shapes drifted, scaly backs slicing the water, massive heads gliding just beneath the surface. At one point, the kayak tilted as something brushed the cockpit rim, water sloshing over the side. Jason's knuckles whitened on the deck. He dared not move a finger to push it back. Time fractured. He whispered encouragement to himself, a silent mantra, just stay calm, stay still, stay alive. Each minute felt like an eternity, every second a battle against panic. The frog's song dimmed, cicadas fell silent, as if the Everglades itself paused to observe his vigil. Before dawn, the glimmering eyes receded one by one, silhouettes slipping away into the gray hush. Jason exhaled so slowly it felt like a betrayal. He stayed motionless until the sky lightened from obsidian to slate. Then, with trembling arms, he scooped up the flashlight, once again useless without batteries, and peeled back the tarp. He blinked in the cool morning air, muscles locked in exhaustion, but mind sharpened by terror. He nudged the kayak forward, each paddle stroke driven by relief and adrenaline. Behind him, the cove returned to its silent watch, as if nothing had happened at all. But Jason knew that first night's vigil had irrevocably changed him, and that the swamp's shadows would follow him wherever he paddled next. Jason's arms trembled with fatigue as the first pale light of dawn brushed across the swamp. He shoved off from the cove's tangled roots, each paddle stroke fueled by raw relief. His gaze flicked to the water's edge, as if expecting the glowing eyes to reappear. The golden haze painted every cypress knee in soft radiance, but Jason felt no comfort, only a fierce determination to put distance between himself and the night's terror. He aimed for what he believed was the same inlet he'd entered the night before. In the weak light, familiar landmarks emerged, a leaning stump half submerged, a cluster of air plants clinging to a crooked branch. His heart lightened. He whispered, "Got you." He paddled harder, splashes echoing like victory taps. Then the current shifted. A subtle tug pulled his kayak off course, angling him toward a narrow channel choked with sawgrass. He fought the flow, leaning into each stroke, but his blistered hands protested. He glanced at his legs, raw red lines where skin had blistered under yesterday's sun, and a spike of panic shot through him. This wasn't supposed to hurt. This was supposed to be an adventure. Determined, he hauled the kayak onto a muddy bank to rest and reassess. He balanced on one leg, using the paddle as a staff, eyes scanning for deeper water. His mouth was parched. He raised the remaining water jug, but the first gulp tasted sour. Stagnant swamp, mingling with plastic. He spat and cursed under his breath. A sudden rustle in the reeds jerked him upright. He spun, paddle raised, searching for movement. Only a heron lifted into the sky, wings wide against the dawn. Jason exhaled, his chest heaving. The adrenaline surge left him lightheaded. He sank back to one knee, pressing a trembling hand to his forehead. He paused the GoPro briefly to record a log. Day 2 morning. Thought I was steering back, but the Everglades has other plans. Blisters forming. Water's almost gone. Need a new strategy. He replaced the camera, but the angle was askew, tilted toward his feet. Frustration pricked his confidence. He stood, repositioning both camera and kayak, then climbed back aboard with a deep breath. Just as he settled, the hull snagged something beneath the surface. Before he could react, the kayak lurched and tipped. Cold water crashed over his shoulders, and he gasped, lungs burning as he surfaced. Murky depths churned around him, roots brushing his wetsuit. He kicked toward the overturned kayak, panic knocking against his ribs. He grabbed the gunwale and hauled himself back into the cockpit, dripping and shivering. His pack, strapped behind the seat, tugged at the stern, sending the bow dipping forward. As he righted himself, he felt two small, slimy shapes adhere to his back. Leeches. He froze for a heartbeat, then slapped frantically, knocking them into the water. Heart hammering, Jason pressed the paddle across his chest, forcing himself to calm. Every fiber in his body screamed to rest, yet he hoisted himself upright and pushed the kayak back into the channel. Water sluiced beneath him, carrying away half a jug of his precious drink. He stared at the shrinking current, then at the distant canopy where mist still clung to cypress branches. For a moment, he closed his eyes and recalled his father's final words before their last trip together. No matter how deep you go, remember how to find your edge. Jason opened his eyes, squared his shoulders, and paddled on into the thinning light, resolved to find his edge and a way back home. By midday on day 2, the swamp bore down on Jason like an oven. The sun glared from a flawless sky, its rays magnified by the water's glassy sheen. Every inch of his exposed skin, neck, forearms, and legs felt aflame beneath his wet clothes. He winced as he shifted in the cockpit, the fabric scraping raw, blistered flesh. His left calf throbbed with stinging pain where the skin had lifted in angry red welts. He peered down at his knees and let out a soft curse. The single protein bar he'd rationed was gone, its crumbs long washed away by his frantic paddling and the swamp's lapping waves. His water supply, too, was perilously low, just enough for a few swallows, but he dared not squander a single drop. Jason exhaled and scanned the horizon of mangrove silhouettes. He needed water and shade. Neither was guaranteed here. He pulled off his soaked shirt, twisting it into a makeshift bandage and pressing it to his calves. Blood and blister fluid mingled on the cotton. The sting was sharp enough to blur his vision momentarily, but he willed himself to focus. Gathering a length of vine-like root hanging from a cypress knee, he fashioned a crude filter. 1 jug of swamp water poured through his shirt into the empty container. Each cloudy gulp that followed tasted of algae and rot, but it was liquid, and it reminded him that he was still alive. He pressed the back of his neck with the shirt-wrapped vine, staunching the worst of his wounds. He paused the GoPro to record a voice memo, each word clipped by exhaustion. Day 2 afternoon, blisters forming into something fierce. Water's tainted, but keeps me moving. Need to find fresh flow or risk dehydration. Heading east toward that break in the canopy I saw at dawn. He stashed the camera under the seat and scanned the air for movement. Kingfishers trilled overhead, and distant herons dipped into hidden pools, but no fresh streams broke through the green wall. He wedged the paddle across the cockpit and reached for his charger, still clinging to life at 20%, but decided against using it. Every moment spent fiddling with electronics here was a risk. With a grunt, he hauled himself from the kayak onto a narrow bank of mud and leaf litter. The ground squelched under his boots as he stepped toward a cluster of palmetto fronds. He bent down, scooping handfuls of wet leaves and piling them behind himself like a makeshift seat back. The shelter was minimal, just enough to blunt the worst of the sun's glare. He rested there for several minutes, breath bobbing in his chest, feeling the ache in his limbs settle into a dull roar. As sweat dripped into his eyes, a wavering shimmer appeared on the water's surface, the distant outline of what looked like a small boat, its hull alight with sunshine. Jason's heart stuttered. He scrambled upright, gripping his paddle as though for balance. The illusion wavered and dissolved into reeds. No whir of engine, no distant shout, just the swamp's hollow silence. Jason let out a ragged laugh that ended in a cough. He glanced at his blistered legs, at the battered kayak half submerged beside him, and felt both a surge of despair and a stubborn spark of determination. The sun dropped slightly toward the west, its heat still unrelenting. He gathered the leaves, stuffed them under his gear for the next night's shelter, and eased back into the cockpit. Each movement was agony, but each stroke of the paddle was a promise. He would endure, he would adapt, and he would find his way out of this unforgiving place. By late afternoon on day 2, the swamp felt alive with unseen threats. Jason's arms trembled as he guided the kayak into a narrow bayou, hoping to find deeper water or a trickle of fresh flow. His legs burned from blisters, his shirt clung heavy to sweat and grime, and every breath tasted of algae-soaked air. The sun had slanted westward, slashing through the canopy in golden shafts that did little to warm but much to blind him. He set the paddle across the cockpit and lifted his water jug, dipping it beneath the surface to refill. Mud swirled around his forearms, and he paused as something soft grazed his skin. A leech. He jerked back, spilling half the jug, but more clung stubbornly to his forearm, fat, writhing, black as oil. He whapped at it, and it released with a dull plop, leaving a stinging welt. Then another grazed his calf. A wave of nausea washed over him. He crouched in the cockpit, ripping off his soaked shirt and wrapping it around each limb to press against the wounds. The sting was sharp, a reminder that the swamp did more than watch. It fed. He tried to steady his breathing, inhaling and exhaling until the world stopped spinning. His mind drifted to 6 months earlier, when he'd trekked a remote canyon in New Mexico for a wildlife shoot. He'd filmed a rare golden eagle, triumph etched in every frame, until he returned home to find his memory card stolen. The hours of footage vanished overnight, leaving only grief and frustration. Back then, he'd vowed never to trust gear or fate again. Now, as the leeches fell from his limbs and the sun dipped low, he wondered if he'd underestimated the Everglades' appetite. He pressed his fingers against his chest, heart pounding as fatigue settled into his bones. The last protein bar wrapper rattled beneath his pack. The water jug was half full of murky sludge. He weighed options: press on until collapse, or find a sheltered spot and wait for rescue, if rescue even came. His face, reflected in the water, drawn and gaunt, stared back with a mixture of defiance and desperation. The sun's last rays flickered through the cypress limbs. Jason rummaged for his plastic tarp, untangling it from mud and debris. He tied it across the cockpit's rim and draped the remaining portion over his shoulders like a hooded cloak. Beneath it he huddled, legs drawn tight, hands clasped together. The dusk chorus of frogs and crickets swelled around him, a living hush that pressed close. He willed his eyelids to stay open, counting each breath. 1, 2, 3, until his mind floated between wakefulness and dreams. He imagined his sister, Megan, pacing in her living room, phone in hand. He saw his father's stern eyes, reminding him to respect the water. Each memory was a lifeline, anchoring him to purpose. Night fell fully, and the swamp exhaled its night song. Jason's body shook with cold and concession, but his spirit held fast. He wrapped the tarp tighter, pressed his face toward a sliver of starless sky, and whispered into the darkness, "I won't let go. Not yet." Jason blinked awake to a copper sky, the dawn light unmoving and harsh as a spotlight over the swamp. His bones ached from the cramped night, every joint protesting. He pushed the tarp aside and peered into the maze of sawgrass that pressed against his kayak like a living wall. The heat already pulsed, the kind that makes you taste the air before the sun even crests the trees. He rummaged for the GoPro, but the lens was clouded with mud. With trembling fingers, he wiped it on his sleeve, hoping for a glimpse of the world beyond his immediate reach. The image that emerged was no wider than the kayak's hull and the slim channel before him. He lowered the camera and inhaled, tasting grit on his tongue. The morning stretched interminably. Jason dipped his paddle into the water and hauled himself forward in silent repetition, each stroke a small victory. He'd abandoned any thought of adventure. Now it was a calculation of distance and time. He probed the shallows with the blade, listening for eddies of fresher flow. He found none. Instead, the water grew shallower, and half-submerged roots scraped the hull. At midday, when the sun hung directly overhead, he spotted a moss-draped branch dangling low. He grabbed it, hauling himself onto a narrow strip of bank. His legs buckled beneath him as he stood, and sweat trickled into his eyes. He smashed a fist against a palm frond, sending a shower of fronds to the ground, and scooped enough leaves to cushion his blistered feet. He knelt and collected pooled drops of water gathered in the fronds, funneling them into his jug, a few precious ounces. The effort cost him more energy than it returned, but he drank deeply, savoring each cold bead sliding down his throat. He tied a frond to his pack as a crude flag, a marker in the ever-repeating green. A testament. I was here. The hours ticked on. The sun burned the world into monochrome. Jason felt himself fray at the edges, thoughts jumbled, memories flickering. He tightened the straps on his life vest as if it could hold him together when every other seam threatened to rip. His mind wandered to the python researchers he'd met once at a wildlife expo, speculating about their slow, patient hunts. He realized he was beginning to stalk his own rescue, or risk becoming the hunted. A sudden breeze lifted the metallic strip of his charger cable, startling him. He grabbed it like a lifeline and checked the battery. 10%. Too precious to waste. He tucked it away and drew his knees to his chest, rocking slightly in the cockpit. He whispered to himself, one foot in front of the other. Just survive until dark. As afternoon waned, the sky softened to a bruised lavender. Shadows lengthened around the cypress knees, and the first distant croak of frogs signaled the coming night. Jason scanned the horizon for any sign of movement, rescue, boat, anything. The swamp offered only stillness. He braced himself for another vigil, wrapping the tarp around his shoulders before darkness fell. The endless day had bent his body and tested his mind, but he had not broken. In the gathering dusk, he pressed his forehead to the paddle and vowed again, I will outlast this place. And as the first stars blinked above the slumbering swamp, he listened for the whisper of hope on the wind. Before dawn broke on day 3, Jason's mind teetered on the edge of delirium. He drifted down a narrow channel, the paddle's scrape against cypress knees, the only sound in the silver gloom. Each breath tasted of brine and exhaustion, and his eyes burned from salt and sweat. He replayed his sister's warning, "Text me your route one more time," and wondered if she'd ever know how close he came to vanishing. In the half-light, a shape appeared ahead. The unmistakable hull of a rescue skiff, hull painted bright white, its bow angled toward him as if inviting salvation. Jason's heart leapt. Adrenaline flared through numb limbs. He straightened in the cockpit and raised his paddle triumphantly, voice cracking on a shouted plea. "Over here!" The boat held. Its engine ticked softly, and a figure leaned over the rail, gesturing urgently. Jason braced himself, then reached to paddle faster, only to find the water beneath him still. Empty. The skiff dissolved into reeds and mist, leaving only the black reflections of mangroves. The engine's promise vanished with it, and Jason sagged forward, pulse hammering. Shadows flickered in his peripheral vision, broken shapes that could be rescue lights or alligator eyes. He stood, desperate to see clearly, and pitched over the side. Cold water engulfed him, knocking the breath from his lungs. For a heartbeat, he lurched underwater, blind in the murk, roots tugging at his life vest. Panic flared. The Everglades wanted him silent and still. His. Survival instincts kicked in. Jason remembered a CPR class from 2 years ago. Tilt the head back, seal the airway, compress the chest. Though upside down in the water, he angled his arms, kicked to the surface, and burst through like a gasping fish. The cool dawn air burned his throat as he clawed at the kayak's rim, hauling himself back into the cockpit. Shivering and coughing, he pressed the paddle to his chest, bracing against the shock. 2 suction marks marred his shoulder where a leech had latched unnoticed in the struggle. He slapped them away, each sting reminding him that every threat here was both patient and cunning. As the sky lightened to rose and gold, Jason sank against the hull, eyes fixed on the empty channel. The phantom boat had been a cruel mirage, a promise he'd almost believed. Yet in that fleeting hope, he found a renewed determination. He would not chase ghosts. The swamp could conjure illusions, but he would rely on the one thing the Everglades could never take from him: his will to survive. Jason's pulse thrummed in his temples as the sun dipped toward evening, painting the swamp in bruised amber. He guided his kayak into a shallow bayou where the water lay flat and dark, like glass over velvet. Here, he hoped to learn something, anything, about the world he'd stumbled into. He crouched on the deck, eyes scanning the muddy bank. There, laid out in a neat line, were tracks twice his hand's width, deep rounded imprints stamped into the mud. Nearby, a churned patch of waterlogged soil bore the telltale sign of scat, fibrous and pungent. Jason's chest tightened at the reminder. He was not merely paddling through the Everglades. He was in the territory of apex predators, students of patience and ambush. A memory flickered. A wilderness survival class 2 years earlier, where an instructor had demonstrated how to craft a spear from a branch and a sharpened rock. Jason had attempted it then, hands fumbling as the teacher's calm voice explained leverage and balance. Now, soaked and raw, he dredged that lesson from the fog of fatigue. He searched the nearby trees until he found a sturdy sapling, curving in the shape of a crook, perfect for a makeshift spear. With gritted teeth, he snapped off a side limb and, using the jagged edge of his kayak's hull scrape, whittled the tip to a dull point. Not elegant, but menacing enough. He lashed the limb to his spare paddle shaft with a strip torn from his shirt, forming a spear-like protrusion. Every fiber of the binding hissed with tension, a promise of resistance. As he worked, the swamp exhaled around him. Cicadas droned, and a heron's distant cry echoed through cypress trunks. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and Jason inhaled deeply, tasting grit and resolve. He laid the spear across the bow of the kayak, within arm's reach, and secured his paddle beneath his legs, ready for both offense and flight. Night fell in velvet swaths. Beneath the sliver of moon, the water's surface rippled, a single splash, deliberate and close. Jason froze, half hidden in shadow, heart hammering. He gripped the spear's shaft, eyes narrowing at the dark shapes moving beneath the glassy sheen. A hulking form passed inches from the hull, its ridged back sliding silently beneath the water. He pressed his breath into his lungs, remembering his father's words after a harsh winter hike. In nature, respect is your shield, and vigilance your sword. Jason's fingers tightened around the spear. He would not cower. For hours he sat, motionless, vigilant, until the ripples ceased and the night's distant hiss faded into the chorus of frogs. Each moment of stillness sharpened his senses. He listened for the soft crack of twigs, watched for the glint of eyes, felt the weight of darkness pressing in. At last the swamp yielded its hush. Jason exhaled, muscles uncoiling like springs released. He tucked the makeshift spear beside him and raised his paddle, testing the water's edge. The lesson was clear. Here, survival required respect, preparation, and the readiness to defend oneself when the world refused mercy. As he drifted into the next channel, spear stowed but mind alight, Jason felt something shift within him, a steel-hard resolve to outlast these waters and the creatures they concealed. The Everglades had taught him a fierce law. In the balance between stalker and stalked, only the vigilant endure. On the fourth morning, the swamp seemed to breathe around the small survey boat charged with hunting invasive pythons. Biologist Dr. Elena Ruiz scanned the waterline through binoculars as her partner, Tom Sinclair, steered. They'd passed dozens of mangrove snags by then, each one a potential nesting site for Burmese pythons, and today's goal was mapping their spread, not rescuing lost. Kayakers. "But look at that," Elena murmured, pointing to a low branch where a yellow hull hung sideways. The kayak's rim was buried in sawgrass, half submerged and slick with algae. Tom eased the boat alongside and dropped the engine into neutral. Ripples carried their echoing voices through the quiet. Elena reached out, touching the stubborn tarp still draped over one end. Beneath it dangled a waterlogged camera bag, its GoPro strap frayed and heavy with moisture. A chill ran down her spine. "Someone's been through hell here," she said. Tom radioed their field station. Possible survivor sighting at Grid 17 Delta. Overturned kayak and gear. Sending coordinates. His tone was professional, but his knuckles whitened on the throttle kill switch. They tied off and stepped onto the mucky bank, boots squelching in dark ooze. Elena nudged aside the tarp with a gloved hand, revealing a tangle of palm fronds. Beneath them, Jason lay curled fetal, soaked to the bone, mud caked around his shoulders, breaths shallow and erratic. "Hey," she called softly, kneeling beside him. "It's okay. We're here." She checked his pulse with practiced calm. It fluttered like a trapped bird. Tom offered a heat blanket from his kit, wrapping it around Jason's trembling form. Jason's lashes fluttered. Emerald eyes, ringed with fatigue, tried to focus. He croaked, "They waited all night, like they were thinking." His voice was a rasp, half lost in the swamp's hush. Elena slipped a finger beneath his chin, lifting his head to clear debris from his mouth. "You're safe now," she whispered. "We've got you." As she radioed for medevac, a flashback flickered through Jason's mind. The dark vigil in the kayak, those glowing eyes glinting beneath the surface. He'd willed himself not to move, not to scream, convinced the Gators were calculating their next move. He'd thought he'd die right there, alone in the black water. Now, bundled in warmth, he felt the weight of salvation settle over him. Behind him, the Everglades lay silent and immense, as though acknowledging his narrow escape. Minutes later, the distant thrum of a helicopter broke the swamp's lull. Jason tensed, then relaxed as the birds circled overhead, rotors churning humid air. Elation and relief washed through him, a torrent matched only by exhaustion. He closed his eyes and let the medic's voice guide him to rising, to rescue, to life beyond the swamp's relentless grasp. When the medevac helicopter's skids touched the hospital lawn, Megan Delaney stood beside the gurney, heart pounding like a drum in her ears. The pale morning light, July 4, 2025, wrapped the trauma center in a calm that belied the frantic hours before. Paramedics lifted Jason's gaunt form into the emergency bay. His skin was gray-streaked, and his breath came in shallow, rattling bursts as monitors bolted beeping rhythms to life. Megan reached for his hand, brushing away the hospital gown's damp folds. His fingers tightened for a flicker of a second, like a message. "I'm still here." She swallowed hard, steeling herself as a nurse urged her back, explaining IV lines, imaging scans, the risk of infection from leech bites and swamp pathogens. Megan nodded, voice caught in her throat, and watched them wheel him away. In the waiting room, time unspooled in sterile minutes. Megan replayed every moment of the phone call, the frantic ring, the distant crackle of radio static. Dr. Ruiz's calm voice confirming they'd found him. She'd driven through moonlit highways, each mile a prayer. Now, beneath fluorescent lights, she let tears slip, grief for what he endured mingling with relief that he'd endured. It. Inside the trauma bay, Jason's world fractured and reassembled in fragments. He saw bright panels overhead, smelled antiseptic and something sweet. Morphine, perhaps. A nurse's gentle apology drifted. "You've lost a lot of fluids. We're giving you blood." He closed his eyes, muscles heavy with exhaustion. A flashback flickered, the hiss of water against hull, the emery sting of blistered skin, the glimmering reptile eyes beneath moonlight. His chest tightened at the memory. When consciousness returned hours later, Megan hovered at his bedside, her face drawn but resolute. Jason blinked against the harsh bulbs, scanning tubes and monitors. His voice was a rasped whisper. "You came." Megan's smile was a tremor of joy and fear. "I always come." She took his hand, fingertips warm against his cool skin. He managed a weak nod, eyes flickering to the GoPro strapped to a bandage at his feet. Its casing cracked, but intact. Over the next days, nurses monitored Jason's vitals. Dehydration, malnutrition, lacerations, healing under careful dressings. He drifted between foggy dreams and lucid recollections, the Python researchers' gentle faces. Pulling him from the mud, the rotor wash that felt like an answer to a silent prayer. Each waking moment felt surreal, like a half-remembered fever dream. Megan sat beside him, scrolling through the GoPro footage on her tablet. She winced as he watched the circle of gators gliding under his kayak, hearts and jaws framed against the lens. "They waited, like they were thinking," he murmured, voice thick with memory. Megan pressed her thumb against his wrist. "You outsmarted them." Later, the surgeon debriefed them. Jason had survived 4 days alone, no beacon, no backup, clinging to scant supplies and raw will. The swelling from his bites had subsided. The antibiotics would clear any infection. Full recovery would take weeks, but the worst was behind him. That night, as Megan tucked him in, Jason gazed at the ceiling. The hospital's hum was a lullaby compared to the swamp's symphony of hisses and crashes. Yet even here, in the whiteness of recovery, he felt the Everglades pulse beneath his skin, a reminder of both terror and triumph. Outside, fireworks began to burst across the sky, distant echoes of celebration. Jason closed his eyes and let the lights wash over him, quietly grateful for rescue and for the chance to tell a story that had nearly ended in silence. Weeks after discharge, Jason sat at his cluttered desk in Megan's guest room, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating walls hung with framed river photos. The cracked GoPro casing lay beside the keyboard like a trophy, mud-streaked, waterlogged, but still holding the moments that nearly defined his ascent. He placed his trembling fingers over the playback button and exhaled. The footage opened on a sunlit ribbon of water, Jason's voice calm as he logged his gear. The 3 bars, 2 jugs of water, every detail mundane until the scene snapped forward to dusk. There, the muted green glow of night vision revealed glinting eyes, a gator's snout pushing against the hull. Jason's grip tightened as the camera wobbled with his unsteady breath, the hollow hiss of reptile musk filling the speakers. Each clip drove the documentary arc he'd always dreamed of, but never at such a price. He watched the circle of gators slip below the surface, heard his own silent prayers while curled in the cockpit. He saw himself, gaunt and sunburned, paddling through blinding heat and choking mud. Toward the end, the frantic scramble after the phantom boat, the plunge into murky water, and finally the relief etched on his face as researchers' voices filtered in. Megan hovered behind him, arms folded. When the final frame faded to black, Jason swallowed hard. "This is everything," he said, voice husky. Megan nodded, wiping tears. It's terrifying and essential. Jason imported the clips into his editing suite, weaving in narration that balanced warning and wonder. I went seeking solitude, his voiceover began, but the Everglades taught me respect the hard way. He cut from the eerie green night vision to sunlit close-ups of cypress roots, underscoring that beauty and danger are inseparable here. As he uploaded the finished video to his channel, he drafted a description that read like a benediction. To every weekend warrior, prepare, respect the swamp, and never go alone. He hit publish, then sank back, heart hammering. Within minutes, notifications pinged. Comments ranged from awed disbelief, no way that's real, to heartfelt gratitude, I'll never underestimate the Everglades again. Some questioned authenticity, others shared their own survival tales. Jason read each, his chest both heavy and full. Late that night, Megan posted her own tribute on her channel, a heartfelt plea for safety and solidarity, dedicated to the brother who'd stared down the swamp's darkest hours and lived to tell the tale. In the comments, viewers lit virtual candles, symbols of hope, respect, and shared humanity. Jason closed his eyes, imagining the murky channels where he had paddled raw and terrified. Now, through this footage, he had given those silent waters a voice, and in doing so, offered both warning and closure to every soul who might dare the Everglades alone. 6 months later, Jason stood once more at the Big Cypress launch ramp, the yellow kayak now replaced by a sleeker, guide-approved vessel outfitted with a satellite beacon blinking a steady green. Morning mist curled over the water like a soft promise. Behind him, Megan tightened the straps on her own life vest, her hand lingering on his shoulder in steady reassurance. He pressed his palm to the familiar aluminum deck, its cool surface grounding him, as he recalled the first time he'd shoved off alone into this maze of cypress and sawgrass. The swamp had been his adversary then, testing every skill, every nerve. Now, it felt like an old, inscrutable friend, beautiful, dangerous, alive. Their guide, Luis, called from the bow, voice calm and confident. "Ready when you are." He wore decades of Everglades knowledge in the lines of his face and the soft holler of his voice. Jason nodded, swallowing the knot of memory and gratitude that swelled in his chest. As Megan eased into her kayak beside him, Jason lifted his paddle and dipped into the dark water. The blade cut through with a whisper, and the twin vessels drifted beneath moss-draped branches. Sunlight shimmered in scattered pools, revealing darting minnows and the occasional turtle basking on a log. Jason raised his GoPro, no longer a lifeline but a tool for sharing the swamp's quiet wonders. He thought of the Gators, their eyes glowing like embers beneath the surface, and of the nights spent frozen in terror. He remembered the sting of blistered skin and the slick slide of leeches, the phantom boat that vanished like a cruel joke, and the researchers whose kindness restored his hope. Each memory was a scar and a lesson: respect, preparation, humility. Luis guided them toward the spot where Jason's first vigil had taken place. He pointed out the crooked branch where the kayak had been tied, now bleached and worn by sun and water. Megan reached out, touching the smooth wood as if to bless it. Jason closed his eyes, feeling the swamp's pulse beneath the rotting bark, as if it acknowledged his survival, his respect. In the distance, a young alligator slipped into the reeds, its silhouette sleek and ancient. Jason watched it go, breath held for a moment, then released in a quiet exhale. The swamp was neither enemy nor ally. It simply was, an ecosystem of beauty and peril woven together. As they paddled back to the ramp, Jason's voiceover slipped into his mind. In the Everglades, you learn more about yourself than the world around you. You learn limits and strength, fear and wonder, And when you emerge, you carry that wilderness inside you. At the dock, Jason and Megan stood side by side, kayaks tied and packs slung over shoulders. He turned to her, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." Megan smiled, squeezing his hand. "Welcome back," she whispered. They walked away from the water together, footsteps light but purposeful. Behind them the swamp settled into its hush, silent witness to a journey of terror, endurance, and finally, reverent understanding.